Welcome, dear friends, to Family Shadows, a place where stories about fathers, children, and the quiet battles within families come alive. If this is your first time here, I invite you to stay a while, listen closely, and if these stories move you, as I believe they will, don't forget to subscribe so you can walk with us through many more journeys of love, betrayal, and quiet justice. Tonight's story is titled, "My Son-in-Law Called Me Pathetic and Slapped Me. I Finally Fought Back." And so, let us begin. David Harris had lived 62 years, and in those years he had seen the rise and fall of small joys, like morning walks with his wife, Linda, before the illness took her away, or the smell of fresh-baked bread that once filled their kitchen when Emily was still a little girl. He had known the kind of happiness that is not written in the papers, nor spoken about at cocktail parties. It was the quiet kind, the way a man looks at his daughter sleeping in the back seat of a car after a long drive, or the sound of his wife humming to herself as she folded laundry. It was that kind of life, ordinary, simple but rich in its own measure, that David had believed would carry him peacefully into his later years. But life is not always kind to those who love quietly. Sometimes it tests them with storms they never asked for. The Harris home, though modest, still bore Linda's touch. Lace curtains she had chosen, still hanging though faded. The oak dining table David had bought second-hand decades ago, now bearing the marks of countless family dinners, homework assignments, and holiday gatherings. On this night, that table became a stage. Emily had invited him over. "Dad, it'll be nice," she had said on the phone, her voice tinged with that familiar nervousness. "Jason wants to cook. Just come, please." David had paused. In his heart, he knew dinners with Jason were rarely nice. But Emily's voice, still the same little girl's voice that once asked him to stay at her bedside during thunderstorms, compelled him. He could never say no. So he put on his old brown jacket, polished the shoes Linda had bought him years ago, and carried with him a small bottle of wine. Not expensive. He didn't believe in spending foolishly, but chosen with care, because he wanted to offer something, anything, to show gratitude. Jason Miller greeted him at the door. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked David up and down, taking in the jacket, the shoes, the wine. "Well," Jason said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "look who's here, the great David Harris. Did you borrow that jacket from a thrift store?" Emily's face flushed. "Jason," she whispered, embarrassed. David smiled faintly, brushing off the sting as he had done so many times before. "Good evening, Jason. Thank you for having me." Dinner began with small talk, Emily asking about the weather, David telling a gentle story about his neighbor's dog. Jason, however, grew restless, his fingers tapping the table, his eyes rolling at every word David spoke. And then it happened. Jason leaned forward, his voice suddenly sharp, each word like a blade. "You know what, David? You're pathetic. A pathetic old man who has nothing. You should be grateful I even let you sit at this table." The room fell silent. Emily's fork clattered onto her plate. David blinked, as if struck not by words but by lightning itself. And before he could even process the cruelty of it, Jason's hand came fast across his face, sharp, loud, undeniable. A slap. The kind of slap that does not merely bruise skin but cuts into dignity. Time for David slowed to a crawl. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the old wall clock, the faint whimper that escaped Emily's lips. He did not raise his hand. He did not shout. He simply sat there, the sting burning across his cheek, his breath catching somewhere between shock and sorrow. Jason leaned back smugly, folding his arms. See, you won't even fight back because you can't. You're nothing, always have been. Emily whispered, tears filling her eyes. Jason, please. But Jason only smirked. And David sat in silence, his eyes lowering to the plate before him. Inside, however, something had shifted. The silence was no longer the silence of surrender. It was the silence of a storm gathering, waiting for its time. That night, as David lay in bed, the slap still echoing on his cheek, he thought not of Jason's words, but of Linda. He remembered the last night at the hospital when she had held his hand and said through shallow breaths, "Promise me you'll protect Emily, even if it means swallowing your pride, even if it means they never know what you gave up." He had promised, and he had kept that promise. But Linda had also once told him, long before the sickness, "There will come a time when silence is no longer love, David. When silence is weakness. When that time comes, you will know." And as David lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he realized that time was coming. The slap was not the end of David Harris, it was the beginning. What Jason believed to be a victory was, in truth, the spark that would awaken a father's quiet justice. For silence has its limits, and once broken, it has the power to shake the very foundations of a home. And so ends the first chapter of tonight's story. What would you do if you were David Harris, sitting at that table, struck by the very man who married your daughter? Stay with me, dear friends, as this journey unfolds. And if you haven't yet, remember to subscribe so you'll be with us for Chapter 2, where David's silence begins to crack and the storm quietly gathers. The morning after the dinner, David Harris rose earlier than usual. Dawn was only a suggestion on the horizon, a faint light pressing against the curtains of his small bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, his hand grazing the spot on his cheek where Jason's slap had landed. The sting had faded, but the memory had not. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stood at the window. The backyard was quiet, a few sparrows pecking at the grass. In the silence of that moment, David thought about Linda again, her laughter in this very kitchen, the way she used to tap his shoulder playfully when he drifted off in his chair. She had been the gentle balance to his sturdy quietness. Without her, the house felt like a museum, rooms filled with relics of love, but no warmth to animate them. David sipped the coffee and let the bitterness sit on his tongue. He had spent his entire life enduring the small humiliations of work, of bills, of illness, of loss. But last night was different. It was not life handing him hardship. It was his own family, his son-in-law. And that thought lodged in him like a splinter he could not remove. Later that afternoon, Emily came by. She always used her own key, one Linda had given her when she was just 20, with a kiss on the forehead and a promise that this house will always be yours no matter what. "Dad." Emily's voice drifted from the doorway. David set down the newspaper he had been pretending to read. "I'm in the kitchen." She walked in, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had been crying since the night before. Her hands twisted nervously at the strap of her purse. "I'm so sorry," she began immediately, her voice cracking. "I didn't know he would." David raised a hand gently. "Emily, stop, it's not your fault." "But he slapped you," she whispered, the word itself hurting her lips. "He called you that word, and I just sat there, Dad. I didn't stop him." David reached across the table, his weathered hand covering hers. "You're my daughter. You don't ever have to apologize for what someone else does." Emily shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I should have defended you. I should have." David's voice was steady, low. You're caught between two worlds, Emily, I know that. I promised your mother I'd never make you choose between me and anyone else. Emily looked at him, startled. Mom said that. He nodded. The night before she passed, she told me, don't put her in the middle. She's fragile in ways she won't show, so I've kept quiet. I've endured. Emily squeezed his hand, her face twisted in guilt. But Dad, your silence, it hurts me too. I feel like you're disappearing. David's eyes lingered on her, soft and sorrowful. He wanted to tell her everything, the documents he kept hidden, the truth about who really held the power. But not yet. Not when she was still trembling in front of him, trying to hold her marriage together with frayed strings. Don't worry about me, David said finally. Worry about yourself. And if Jason ever lays a hand on you, his jaw tightened and his voice grew sharp for the first time. I won't stay silent then. Emily nodded, though uncertainty clouded her face. Days passed and David kept to his routine. Morning walks, afternoon chores, evenings alone with the television humming. But inside, silence became heavier than sound. At the grocery store, he thought he saw whispers in the way the cashier glanced at him. Had Jason already boasted about humiliating his father-in-law? At church, during Sunday service, David felt the stares linger too long, though no one said a word. He carried his dignity like an old coat, patched, worn thin, but still wrapped tightly around him. One evening, as he trimmed the roses in the garden Linda once adored, he overheard the neighbors laughing next door. A phrase caught his ear, pathetic old man, and though it was surely not about him, his heart sank. Words have a way of echoing long after they are spoken. David returned inside, washed his hands, and stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. His reflection showed a man older than he felt inside. Lines etched by years of sacrifice, eyes that had seen too much loss. A man who, in the silence of his own home, wondered if Jason might be right. But then, almost instinctively, he reached into the drawer beneath the sink and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were copies of documents, titles, deeds, accounts that Jason had no idea existed. David looked at them for a long moment. Then he slid them back, closed the drawer, and whispered to himself, "Not yet." It was Emily again who extended the invitation. "Dad, can you come over this Friday? Jason, he said he wants to apologize." David hesitated. Apologies from men like Jason rarely came without strings attached, but he agreed for Emily's sake. When Friday came, David arrived promptly at 7. Emily hugged him tightly at the door, whispering, "Please just keep the peace tonight." Inside, Jason was already seated at the table, a glass of wine in hand. His grin was wide, but his eyes cold. "David," Jason said smoothly, "good to see you again. About the other night, I might have been out of line." Emily looked between them, desperate for harmony. David nodded slowly. "Might have been." Jason chuckled, sipping his wine. "Well, you know how it is. A man gets frustrated. I didn't mean anything by it. You shouldn't take things so seriously." Emily's face tightened, but she said nothing. David sat down, folding his hands in his lap. His silence returned, not the silence of surrender, but of calculation. Every word Jason spoke revealed more about the man he truly was. Arrogant, dismissive, certain of his control. At one point, Jason leaned closer, his breath heavy with drink. "You know, David, this house, it'll be ours soon enough. Everything you have, it all flows to us eventually. That's how it works. Old men fade, the young take over." David looked at him steadily, his lips pressed into a thin line. Inside, the storm swelled, but outwardly he remained silent. That night, as David walked home beneath the street lamps, he felt the silence cracking inside him like ice under pressure. He thought of Linda again, of her words, of Emily's tears. He thought of Jason's smug face, the slap, the laughter. There are moments in a man's life when he realizes the weight of his years is not a weakness but a weapon. David knew the time was drawing near. The silence he had carried all these years was about to break, and when it did, it would not be with fists or shouting, but with something far more powerful. He reached his front door, paused, and whispered into the quiet night. Not much longer. The following Sunday, David sat in the wooden pew of the old church he had attended for decades. The stained glass windows glowed with soft morning light, casting colors over the congregation. To others, it was an ordinary service. To David, it was a sanctuary where memories refused to stay buried. The hymns reminded him of Linda, her voice always slightly off-key, but sung with such conviction that David had often smiled just to hear it. He could still picture her beside him, her hand resting lightly on his, squeezing at certain phrases as if to say, "We're still here together." But now the seat beside him was empty. David closed his eyes, letting the words of the hymn drift around him like smoke, and then, without meaning to, he was back in another time, another echo of the past. It was the last winter of Linda's life. Snow had fallen thick outside, blanketing the yard, muffling the world in silence. David had sat by her hospital bed, the fluorescent lights casting her face in pale hues. Linda's breath was shallow, but her eyes remained sharp. She had looked at him with the same fire she had always carried, even in her final days. "David," she whispered, her voice frail but steady, "promise me something." He leaned closer, holding her hand as though it might slip away if he loosened his grip. "Anything, Linda, anything at all. You protect Emily," she said, the words catching in her throat. "She's strong, yes, but she doesn't know how to fight men like Jason. She trusts too easily. Don't let anyone break her spirit." David had nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "I'll protect her, always." Linda coughed, then forced a faint smile. "But also, don't lose yourself. Don't let them take your dignity, David. There's a difference between silence out of love and silence out of fear." Her words had pierced him then, and now, years later, they still echoed in his chest. Leaving the church that morning, David walked slowly down the steps, the cool air filling his lungs. Emily was waiting for him by the car. "Dad," she said softly, "can we go for a drive?" He agreed, and soon they were rolling down the quiet back roads of their town, the fields stretching endlessly on both sides. Emily kept her eyes on the road, her hands tight around the steering wheel. "Jason's been worse lately. He drinks too much. He says things that," her voice faltered. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in my own marriage." David turned his head, studying her profile. His little girl, the one who used to braid her doll's hair and chase fireflies in the yard, now sitting beside him with lines of worry etched into her forehead. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "you don't deserve to live like that." She bit her lip. "But what choice do I have? I have no income of my own, Dad. Jason handles everything. The house, the bills, even the car I'm driving right now, it's all in his name. If I left him, I'd have nothing." David's hand twitched at his side. How badly he wanted to tell her she was wrong. That the foundation of her life was not Jason, but him. That quietly, secretly, he had built safety nets she didn't even know existed. But he held his tongue. Not yet. Timing mattered. If he revealed the truth too soon, it might drive her back into Jason's arms out of pride or shame. "Sometimes," David said instead, "what looks like nothing is more than you think. And what looks like everything, he paused, choosing his words, isn't worth a dime. Emily glanced at him, puzzled, but she didn't press. Later that week, Jason arrived at David's house uninvited. The knock on the door was not a knock at all, but a pounding, sharp and impatient. David opened it to find Jason standing there, his shirt untucked, his tie loose, his eyes glazed with the aftertaste of alcohol. "David," Jason said, stepping inside without being asked. "We need to talk." David folded his arms, standing firm. "Then talk." Jason looked around the modest living room, sneering at the outdated furniture, the family photos, the clutter of a life lived honestly. "You know, Emily worries too much about you. She thinks you're fragile, but I know the truth. You're just useless." The words rolled off Jason's tongue like poison. David remained silent, though his jaw clenched. Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You won't get in our way. This house, your money, whatever scraps you think you have, they'll all be ours soon. Don't bother pretending otherwise." David's eyes flickered. For the first time, Jason saw a glint of something other than passivity. Something colder. But then David turned away, picked up a stack of old mail from the table and said nothing. Jason smirked. "That's what I thought." And with that he left, slamming the door behind him. That night David sat at his desk. He pulled open the bottom drawer and took out the folder he had hidden for years. Inside were all the truths Jason could not imagine. The deed to the house Jason lived in, still legally under David's name. Investment accounts quietly built over decades, untouched. A trust fund Linda had insisted on setting aside for Emily, unknown to her. David leafed through the papers slowly, carefully, like a priest handling scripture. Linda's voice echoed again in his mind. "Don't lose yourself, David. Don't let them take your dignity." The slap had lit the match. Jason's arrogance poured fuel on it. Emily's fragility gave it purpose. The storm was no longer distant. It was gathering inside him, heavy, inevitable. David closed the folder, placed it back in the drawer, and locked it. Soon, he thought. Very soon. The weeks after Jason's uninvited visit carried an unease that clung to David like the dampness of late autumn air. Every time the phone rang, he half expected Emily's voice trembling on the other end. Every knock on the door sent a ripple of tension through him. Jason was becoming reckless, and recklessness in men like him often led to cruelty. One evening, Emily called. Her voice was tight, almost broken. "Dad, can you come over tomorrow? Jason, he's been talking about you again. I don't like where this is heading." David agreed without hesitation. He could hear the fear in her words, the same kind of fear he used to hear when she was a child standing outside her mother's hospital room, afraid to walk in. He promised himself he would not allow Jason's shadow to swallow her whole. The next evening, David arrived at Emily's home just after sunset. He carried no wine this time, no small gestures of peace. He came with only himself, steady and unyielding. Emily opened the door, her face pale. She hugged her father quickly before glancing over her shoulder. "He's in the living room," she whispered. "Please, Dad, don't let it get ugly." David nodded but said nothing. Inside, Jason sat sprawled on the couch, a drink in his hand, the television blaring sports highlights no one was watching. When he saw David, a smirk spread across his face, slow and deliberate. Well, Jason said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The pathetic old man returns." Emily flinched. "Jason, stop it." Jason ignored her, his eyes fixed on David. "Tell me, do you like being our charity case? Sitting at my table, eating my food, pretending you still matter?" David's silence was like a wall. He stood tall, his eyes locked on Jason's, not wavering. Jason laughed, bitter and sharp. "Look at you. Not even enough spine to defend yourself. You're nothing but a burden." Jason rose suddenly, the drink sloshing in his hand. He moved toward David, his steps heavy, deliberate. He stopped just inches away, his breath sour with liquor. "You think you belong here?" Jason sneered, and with a sudden motion he shoved David's shoulder hard enough that the older man staggered back a step, colliding with the edge of the dining table. Emily gasped, rushing forward. "Jason, enough!" But Jason wasn't finished. He advanced again, this time knocking the chair from under the table with a swift kick, sending it crashing to the floor beside David. "Pathetic." Jason spat again, the word like venom. "That's all you are, pathetic." David steadied himself, one hand gripping the table's edge. He did not speak. His silence filled the room like thunderclouds gathering overhead. Emily's sobs were the only sound, trembling against the harsh rhythm of Jason's anger. In that moment, something changed inside David Harris. His silence was no longer surrender. It was a forge. Every insult, every shove, every cruel word Jason had ever hurled at him hammered against the steel of his patience, reshaping it into resolve. He thought of Linda, of her voice telling him not to let his dignity be stolen. He thought of Emily's fragility, her quiet suffering in the shadow of a man who called himself strong but was nothing more than a bully. And he thought of his own life, decades of sacrifice, of working 2 jobs to keep food on the table, of saving pennies so Emily could go to college, of sitting through long nights of pain when Linda's illness grew unbearable. Jason knew nothing of that. Jason only saw an old man, one who stayed quiet, but David knew silence could be power, and when it broke, it could shatter everything. David straightened his back, his eyes narrowing on Jason. For the first time, his voice emerged, deep and deliberate. "Be careful, Jason." Jason blinked, caught off guard for half a second before laughter spilled out of him. "Careful? What are you gonna do, old man? Call the cops? Write me a sad letter? You've got nothing." David didn't answer, but his gaze never faltered. It was the kind of gaze Jason had never seen before, the gaze of a man who had decided quietly that his days of enduring were numbered. Emily clutched her father's arm, whispering, "Dad, please, let's go." David allowed her to lead him toward the door. But just before leaving, he turned his head slightly toward Jason and said, calm as stone, "You'll learn soon enough." Jason scoffed, waving his hand dismissively, but there was a flicker in his eyes, just a flicker that betrayed unease. On the drive home, Emily wept softly. "Dad, I can't live like this anymore. He's cruel. He's angry all the time, and he hurts you too." David placed a hand gently over hers as she drove. "Emily, storms always pass, but sometimes a man has to bring the storm himself." Emily glanced at him, startled by the firmness in his voice, but she said nothing. When David returned to his quiet home, he went straight to the drawer where the documents lay hidden. He unlocked it, spread the papers across his desk, and studied them under the dim glow of the lamp. Every insult Jason had thrown, every humiliation endured had led to this. The boiling point was here. The storm was ready. David whispered into the night, his voice steady, resolute. No more silence. The day of confrontation came on a quiet Saturday. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to hang low over the town, pressing down as if the world itself anticipated something. David had woken early, long before the sun, and sat at his desk with the stack of documents spread neatly before him. His hands rested on the papers, steady, as if drawing strength from the years of labor they represented. He wasn't a man who enjoyed conflict. All his life, he had chosen peace, Whether at work, where his supervisor had once barked insults in front of the crew, or at home, where Linda had gently scolded him for letting neighbors take advantage of his kindness. But there comes a moment when a man realizes that peace is not the same as surrender, and silence is not the same as weakness. David folded the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it carefully inside his jacket. Then he stood, buttoned the coat, and looked at himself in the mirror. For the first time in years, he saw not a fragile old man, but a father, a protector, a husband honoring the memory of the woman who had loved him. Emily had invited him for dinner again, almost pleading on the phone. "Dad, please come. He's calmer now. Maybe we can just sit together, try to be a family." David had agreed, not because he believed Jason had changed, but because he knew the time for silence was over. When he arrived at the house, Emily greeted him with a nervous smile. Her eyes searched his face, as though trying to read his mood. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. Jason was already at the table, a glass of whiskey in hand. He didn't rise, didn't smile. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his mouth twisted into that same smirk David had come to know too well. "Well," Jason said, "if it isn't the guest of honor." David sat down opposite him. Emily quickly filled the plates, her hands trembling as she moved between them, trying to create a fragile illusion of normalcy. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of silverware against porcelain. Jason took long sips from his glass, his eyes never leaving David. Finally, he set the glass down with a thud. "You know, David," he began, his tone cutting, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we made some changes around here. This house is too much for Emily and me to handle alone. Why don't you sign it over to us? Save everyone the trouble." Emily froze, her fork halfway to her lips. "Jason," she started, but Jason cut her off. "Don't, Emily, it's practical. He doesn't need it, we do." David looked at him calmly, his hands folded on the table. "This house," he said softly, "isn't yours to claim." Jason's laugh was short and bitter. "Everything you have will be ours eventually. That's how life works. Old men fade, young men take over. It's just a matter of time." For years, David had endured these words. He had swallowed his pride, told himself silence was strength, that humility was the higher path. But tonight, the words no longer stung, they ignited. David pushed back his chair and rose slowly to his feet. The room seemed to shrink, the air heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. Emily stared at him, wide-eyed, her lips parted but voiceless. Jason leaned back, smirking. "What's this?" The old man finally found his voice. David's gaze was steady, unflinching. His voice, when it came, was firm, deep, and carried a gravity that silenced even Jason's mocking tone. "Enough." The single word cut through the room like a blade. Emily gasped softly, as though hearing her father for the first time. David leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Jason's. "You have insulted me, humiliated me, even raised your hand against me, and I've stayed silent, not because I am weak, not because I am afraid, but because I promised Emily's mother I would protect her peace. That promise is the only reason I've tolerated your cruelty." Jason's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat. "But understand this," David continued, his voice growing firmer. "My silence ends tonight." Jason's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, trying to tower over David. "Or what?" he challenged, his jaw tight, his fists clenching at his sides. "What can you possibly do?" David did not flinch. He straightened his back, meeting Jason's height with dignity, if not with strength. "You'll learn soon enough." Emily rose as well, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please, both of you, stop." But neither man looked at her. Jason laughed again, but the sound was strained, brittle. You think you scare me, old man. You're pathetic. You've always been pathetic. David's expression hardened. No, Jason, what's pathetic is a man who confuses cruelty with strength. A man who hides his fear behind insults and whiskey. A man who thinks power is taken by force, when in truth it is given by trust. The words landed heavier than any slap. For the first time, Jason had no retort. The room fell silent except for the sound of Emily's soft sobbing. David reached into his jacket, his hand brushing against the envelope of documents he had carried. Not yet, he told himself. Soon, but not yet. Tonight was not the night for papers and signatures. Tonight was for truth. He withdrew his hand empty, but his eyes told Jason everything. The game had changed. Jason finally broke the silence with a snarl. You think this is over. You're nothing without me. Emily's nothing without me. Don't forget that. David shook his head slowly. No, Jason, you're the one who's nothing without control, and control doesn't last forever. He turned to Emily, his voice softening. Remember what your mother always said, Emily. Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't strike. It stands, quiet, steady, and unshaken. Emily's tears spilled over. She looked between her father and her husband, and for the first time the choice no longer seemed impossible. David placed his hands on the table, leaned forward slightly, and spoke in a tone that carried the weight of all his years. This is my last warning, Jason. The next time you try to take what isn't yours or raise your hand in this house, you will regret it. The room was heavy with silence. Even Jason, his fists still tight, did not move. David stood tall, nodded once to his daughter, and walked to the door. Each step was measured, deliberate, the silence behind him louder than any shouted word. And in that silence, Jason realized something he had never imagined. The old man he thought he could break was the one preparing to break him. The following week unfolded in heavy silence. Emily called her father almost every evening, her voice small through the receiver, carrying the exhaustion of someone trying to live between two storms. Jason's temper had not cooled. If anything, the confrontation at the dinner table had stirred something darker in him, a need to prove he still held control. Dad, Emily whispered one night, I don't know how much longer I can take this. He's angrier than ever. He keeps talking about money, about the house, about how you should hand everything over. I feel like I'm trapped. David listened quietly. His thumb traced the edge of the phone, his mind weighing each word she spoke. He longed to tell her everything, that she was not trapped, that the ground beneath her life was not Jason's but his. Yet he knew timing mattered. Truth revealed too early could be a weapon turned against the very person it was meant to protect. Hold on, Emily, he said gently. Just hold on a little longer. You're not as powerless as you think. 2 days later, Jason appeared again at David's house. This time he wasn't drunk. He was sharp, eyes narrowed, voice clipped. You and I need to talk, Jason said, stepping inside before David could respond. David closed the door behind him, calm as always. Then talk. Jason paced the living room, his jaw tight. I've been looking into things, trying to get paperwork in order, for when the time comes, but I keep hitting walls. Property records, accounts, things don't line up. It's almost like you've been hiding something. David's eyes didn't flicker. And what exactly do you think I've been hiding? Jason turned on him, his voice low and sharp. Don't play dumb. Emily thinks you've got nothing, but I know better. I can feel it. You're sitting on something, aren't you? Some kind of money, some kind of safety net. And let me be clear, David. If you think you can cut me out, you're making a mistake. For a long moment, David simply regarded him. The man before him was puffed up with arrogance, convinced of his own cleverness, blind to how small he looked. Finally, David spoke, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Jason, you've built your life on the assumption that everything I have will one day be yours. But you've mistaken silence for emptiness. I am not an empty man." Jason frowned, caught off guard by the steadiness of his words. David stepped closer, his presence suddenly larger than his age should have allowed. "When I go, Jason, nothing will pass to you. Not the house you sit in, not the money you dream about, not even the scraps from my table. Everything I've built, everything Linda and I worked for, it belongs to Emily. And it always has." Jason's mouth opened, but no sound came out. David walked to his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the envelope he had guarded for years. The thick paper crackled as he laid it on the table. "You want to see what I've been hiding?" David said, his voice steady. "Then look." Jason hesitated, then snatched the envelope, tearing it open. Inside, he found the deeds, the accounts, the trust Linda had insisted upon. His eyes widened as he flipped through the papers, realization dawning with every line he read. "This," Jason stammered, "this can't be right. The house, it's still in your name. The accounts, these balances." He looked up, his face pale. "You've been sitting on all of this while I thought you had nothing." David's gaze was unwavering. "I chose silence, not because I was powerless, but because Emily deserved peace. But you mistook my quiet for weakness. You thought humiliation could strip me of dignity. You were wrong." Jason's hands trembled as he held the papers. For the first time since David had known him, the mask of arrogance slipped, revealing fear beneath. The sound of the front door opening broke the tension. Emily stepped inside, calling out, "Dad, I thought I'd bring you dinner." Her words froze as she saw Jason at the table, papers scattered in front of him. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice wavering. Jason turned to her, desperate now. "Emily, listen to me. Your father, he's been hiding everything from you. He's been keeping secrets." Emily's eyes darted to David, searching. David's face softened. He gestured for her to come closer. "Emily, your mother and I saved for you. We built this life for you, not for him. Every account, every deed, it's all yours, always has been." Emily's breath caught. She stepped closer, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "Dad, is this true?" David nodded. "Your mother made me promise to protect you, to give you strength even if you didn't know it was there. I stayed silent so you could live without fear. But it's time you knew the truth." Emily looked at the papers, then at Jason. In that moment, clarity washed over her. The life she thought depended on her husband had always been secured by her father's quiet strength. Jason's face twisted, desperate and angry. "You can't just cut me out. I'm her husband. What's hers is mine." David's eyes turned cold steel beneath the kindness. "No, Jason, what's Emily's is hers. You've confused entitlement with love, control with care. And now you stand exposed, not as a man of strength, but as a coward who built his pride on lies." Jason slammed the papers onto the table, his voice breaking into a shout. "This isn't over." But Emily stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "Yes, Jason, it is." Jason stared at her, stunned, as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. And in truth, it had. Jason stood in the middle of the room, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The papers lay scattered on the table, fluttering slightly each time he moved, as though even the weight of the truth made the air heavier. His smirk was gone. The confidence that had once dripped from every word seemed to have drained out of him, leaving only a hollow anger, brittle and desperate. Emily did not move closer. She stood between her father and her husband, her hands trembling, her heart torn between fear and something new, resolve. "Emily," Jason said, his voice cracked with disbelief. "You can't possibly believe him over me. He's been manipulating you this whole time, keeping secrets, hiding money. This is classic control, can't you see?" Emily's eyes brimmed with tears, but her voice was steady. "No, Jason, I see clearly for the first time. The only one who's tried to control me is you." Jason blinked as though slapped himself. "I've given you everything," he shouted. "This house, this life." "This house is my father's," Emily interrupted, her voice breaking through with sudden strength. "This life was built on his sacrifices, and all you've done is belittle him, humiliate him, and now you've tried to take what was never yours." Jason turned to David, rage flashing again. "You turned her against me." David's eyes were calm, his voice low but firm. "No, Jason, you did that all on your own." Jason's fists clenched at his sides, his whole body taut with fury. He had always relied on dominance, on loud words, on sharp insults, on the force of his presence. But none of it worked now. His words bounced off David's calmness, his anger dissolved in Emily's awakening. "You don't understand," Jason muttered, his voice unraveling. "I built my future around this, around what you had. It was supposed to be mine. You can't just take it away." David shook his head slowly. "It was never yours to begin with." Jason staggered back as though the truth itself struck him harder than any fist could. He looked down at the papers again, his lips moving soundlessly as though hoping the numbers, the signatures, the names might change if he stared hard enough. Emily stepped forward then, her tears finally falling, but her voice stronger than it had ever been. "Jason, I can't live like this anymore. I won't. All these years I thought my father was the fragile one. I thought I had to protect you, soothe you, carry the weight of your anger, but I was wrong. My father's silence wasn't weakness, it was strength, and your arrogance wasn't strength, it was cowardice." Jason's mouth opened, but no sound came. "I want you to leave," Emily said. Jason's eyes widened. "What?" "I want you out of this house, out of my life, out of my father's life. Leave, Jason, tonight." For a moment, Jason looked at her as if she were a stranger. The woman who had once bowed under his temper now stood tall, unshaken, her father's quiet courage burning in her eyes. Jason tried one last time, his voice desperate. "Emily, you don't mean this. You can't throw me away after everything." But Emily cut him off, her hand trembling as she pointed toward the door. "Go." Jason looked at David as though expecting some plea for peace, some return to silence. But David only held his gaze, steady, unyielding. The old man he had once called pathetic now stood like stone, immovable. The weight of it crushed Jason more than any argument. With a sharp motion, he grabbed his jacket from the chair, the papers still scattered on the table. He muttered curses under his breath, his face pale with fury, but he did not linger. He stormed toward the door, flung it open, and slammed it shut behind him with such force the walls seemed to shudder. For a long time, the house was silent. The only sound was Emily's sobs breaking into the stillness, her body trembling as though years of fear were leaving her all at once. David stepped forward, placing his arms around his daughter. She clung to him like a child again, her tears soaking his jacket. "Dad," she whispered, "I should have seen it sooner. I should have trusted you." David kissed the top of her head, his voice tender. "It doesn't matter when you see the truth, Emily. Only that you see it at all." Outside, Jason's car roared to life, tires screeching as he sped away into the night. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how loud his anger, he could not escape what had happened. His fall was not just the loss of property or money or even his marriage. It was the collapse of the mask he had worn for so long, the mask of arrogance that hid his insecurity, the mask of dominance that disguised his fear. And in its place was nothing. Inside the house, David sat at the table once more, the papers now gathered neatly into their envelope. He looked at Emily, whose eyes, though red from crying, now carried a glimmer of strength he hadn't seen in years. In that moment, David understood. His silence had served its purpose. The storm had passed, and in its wake the truth had restored not only his dignity but also his daughter's courage. The night after Jason left, the Harris home was still. For the first time in years, there was no tension creeping through the walls, no voice raised in cruelty, no footsteps pacing with anger. Only the quiet remained, a quiet not of fear but of peace. David sat by the window in his armchair, a soft lamp glowing beside him. On the small table lay the envelope of papers once more, now neatly bound with a ribbon. Across the room, Emily was curled up on the sofa, her eyes swollen from tears but her breathing steady, as if sleep had finally returned to her after years of restless nights. David looked at her and thought of Linda. He imagined her sitting in the same room, her warm hand resting on his shoulder, her voice whispering, "You did it, David, you kept your promise." The thought brought a rare smile to his face. When morning came, Emily woke to the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. She walked in to find her father pouring 2 cups, one for her, one for himself. The sight moved her deeply, so ordinary, so simple, yet filled with a love Jason had never understood. She sat down, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Dad," she said softly, "I don't know how to thank you." David shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. I'm your father. That's what fathers do." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were different tears of relief, of recognition, of love. "I used to think your silence meant you were weak," she admitted. "But now I know it meant you were stronger than I ever realized." David reached across the table and placed his hand gently over hers. "Strength isn't always about raising your voice, Emily. Sometimes it's about waiting for the right moment to speak. And when you do, the truth is louder than any shout." Later that week, David called Emily into his study. He opened the desk drawer one final time and handed her the envelope, the ribbon still tied around it. "What's this?" she asked. "It's yours," David said simply. "Everything your mother and I saved, everything we built, it was always meant for you. Now it's time you carry it forward." Emily's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. She pressed it to her chest, her voice breaking. "Dad, I don't deserve this." David's smile was tender. "You deserve more than you know. And one day when you have children of your own, you'll understand what it means to give without expecting anything back." Jason's absence was not spoken of much after that. Word spread, of course. Neighbors noticed his car was gone. Whispers traveled through church pews. But David never spoke ill of him, never recounted the insults, never relived the slap. Justice, David knew, didn't always arrive in noise and fury. Sometimes it came quietly, through dignity reclaimed, through peace restored, through the steady hand of a father protecting what mattered most. In the evenings, David often sat on the porch, watching the sun sink low behind the trees. Emily sometimes joined him, resting her head on his shoulder, and together they would sit in silence. But this silence was different. It was the silence of love, of safety, of home. And though Linda was gone, David felt her presence in every moment, in Emily's renewed strength, in the laughter that slowly returned to the house, in the simple act of drinking coffee together at the kitchen table. He had kept his promise. He had defended his dignity. And in the quiet way only a father could, he had delivered justice. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with me through this story on family shadows. These tales remind us that silence is not weakness, and that true strength often reveals itself in quiet, steady love. I hope this story touched your heart and perhaps reminded you of the sacrifices your own parents or grandparents made out of love. From my heart to yours, I wish you and your families health, peace, and happiness. Treasure each other, hold on to the bonds that matter, and remember, in every shadow of family there is light waiting to be found.